Welcome to a new episode from English Plus Podcast. Today's episode, we will talk about grammar and we will focus on the past simple and the past continuous. So today it is going to be about how to talk about the past. And of course, the focus will be on the past simple and the past continuous. So without further ado, let's start talking right away and let's start with the past simple tense. Now, for example, we can say it snowed yesterday or Tom watched TV last night. Why do we use the past simple here? Because at one particular time in the past, this happened. It began and ended in the past. And most past simple verbs add ed, like when we say it snowed, we add ed to snow, and Tom watched, ed, we add it to watch. But some verbs have irregular past tense forms. For example, if we say Jack went to work early, now went is the past of go. Or I came to work late, and that is the past of come. It's came. Or we saw a great movie last night, and that is the past of see. The past of see is saw. So these verbs are irregular verbs. And of course, there's no point in listing all the irregular verbs in one episode because there are a lot of lists that you can find, and I will make sure to include one of these lists in the show notes. In this link you will find in the description of this episode. You can go to our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. You will find the exercises you need, and I will include a list of all the irregular verbs. Anyway, we talked about the past simple. We use it when we talk about something that happened, began, and ended in the past. And we talked about the past simple in terms of regular and irregular verbs. And although I said I'm not going to mention all irregular verbs, but I have to mention the past simple of verb to be since it's one of the most famous verbs in English. And the past simple of verb to be is special because it has two forms in the past instead of one. It is irregular, obviously, but it has two forms instead of one. So while verb to be is am, is, are in the present, in the past it is was or were. We use was with I, he, she, it, and we use were with we, you, and they. Now, one thing you have to pay attention to before we move on and talk about the form of the past simple is the sequence of tenses. Now, when we have a series of actions, we usually use the same tense. I'll give you an example. Maybe we're talking about Andrew, who is a ball player. So Andrew caught the ball, ran down the field, and scored a point. So here we said caught, ran, and scored. Now, all of these verbs are in the past simple. Now, when you have a series of actions like this, make sure the verbs are the same tense. For example, you can't say Andrew caught the ball, is running down the field, and score a point. So we use past simple, present continuous, and present simple. It doesn't work this way. Well, I have to say that, yes, sometimes we do that, and sometimes you may hear of that, but as a general rule of thumb, you have to keep in mind that keep your tenses, especially in sequence, in series of actions, keep the same tense. Now, with that being said, let's move on to talk about the regular verb forms. Now, when we talk about affirmative, of course, we said that we add ed. And fortunately, most verbs are regular. So most verbs will take an ed. Like when we say help, becomes helped, ed. And the good news that it's not the same like the present simple where we have to add an s for he, she, it. No, it's the same for all the pronouns. So I, you, he, she, it, we, they, helped. It's the same. It doesn't change. But of course, you have to pay attention when you turn that into negative and questions. Now, when you turn that into negative or questions, of course, instead of using do or does like we do in the present simple, we use did because we're talking about the past simple here. But make sure to return the verb to its original form, the main verb I'm talking about. So, for example, I say I did not, that's negative, I did not help without ed. And that is a common mistake that people use did for negatives or for questions, and they keep the ed with the main verb because it is an easy mistake to make, to be honest. Don't feel terrible if you make that mistake. Everyone makes this mistake, but I just want you to pay attention to it. Yes, in the negative, we use did not. We say I did not, she did not, we did not, etc. but make sure to put the verb back in its original form. So, I did not help, or she did not help, etc. And when we want to create a question, we use did, and of course, we put it first. So we say, did I, did you, did he, did she, did we, did they, etc. Help, again, make sure you use help, or any other verb for that matter, in its original form. Don't add anything to it. So did I help? Did you help? Without ed. Now, the same goes, of course, for irregular verb forms. But irregular verb forms, as I told you, irregular verbs do not have a rule at all. So I can tell you, for example, if you find EA in the verb, it is going to be AT, like eat and ate. There's no rule, simply no rule. You will have to look at the chart, the irregular verb chart, and learn about them. Of course, you don't have to read them all and memorize them all, but check the list now and then and learn a couple every time, and you will add to your irregular verb arsenal, and then eventually you will learn all of them. But as we said about regular verbs, we add ed in affirmative. The same goes for irregular verbs, of course, without ed. But for example, we say, I ate, you ate, he ate, she ate, we ate, they ate, and that's the past of eat, of course. As I told you earlier, fortunately, we don't have a special S for he, she, it like we do in the present simple. And when we want to say that in negative, it's the same thing. We use did not, and we put the verb back in its original form. And that's very important. And here people make the most mistakes because it is natural now, or especially after you use irregular verbs for a while, it becomes natural to say ate in the past. And you spend a lot of time learning to use ate, the past of eat, came, the past of come, etc. So when you use I didn't came, no, it's not I didn't came, I didn't come, I didn't eat. Remember, when we use did not, we put the main verb back in its original form, and it's very easy to leave it in the past form. Just keep that in mind. And as I told you earlier, it's not a big deal if you make this mistake. Everyone makes this mistake. Just pay attention not to. And in the questions, obviously, it's the same thing. Did I eat? Did you eat? Did he eat? Etc. Now, with verb to be, it's a different story because verb to be doesn't need any other helping verbs. Verb to be doesn't need do or did to make questions or negatives. It can do that on its own. So in the affirmative, we say I, he, she, it was here. But in the negative, I don't need did. I can say I, he, she, it was not here or wasn't here. And in questions, I say was I or was he or was she here? And the same, of course, goes for were, which is used for you, we, and they. We say you, we, or they were not here in negative. And in questions, were you, were we, were they here? So verb to be is proud. It doesn't need any other verb to help it create negatives or questions, unlike other ordinary verbs. Okay, so just remember, verb to be is enough on its own to create negatives or questions, but of course, was or were, not am is are, which is the present form. So with that being said, let's move on now to talk about the past simple versus the past progressive or the past continuous. But before we do that, let me remind you that you can find a link in the description of this episode that will take you to our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. There you will find the show notes and exercises you can use to master the points we're talking about here, to practice and master the points we're talking about here. Now, we create a myriad of activities. We have interactive activities, interactive videos, and a PDF downloadable worksheet with every single episode. Now, of course, we don't do that for every episode just the same way. It depends on the content of the episode. We create interactive videos for some episodes, we create videos for some other episodes, but we have exercises for all the episodes. So, for example, for this episode, there is a PDF practice worksheet that you can download and practice with the answer key, of course, to check your answers. And there's one more thing. If you like the content we're creating here in English Plus Podcast, you might want to support us and become our patron on Patreon. There's also another link that will take you to Patreon. Take the link, go to Patreon, and support English Plus Podcast and help us create more of the content you love. And one final link will take you to our mailing list. Subscribe to our mailing list, and every 2 weeks you will get an update on our schedule and you will get a special gift every time. I'm not going to tell you what the gift is, but you will be surprised. Now, with that being said, let's move back and talk about the simple past and the past progressive, or as we say, the past continuous. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Some people say the past continuous. Some people say the past progressive. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you understand the difference between the simple past and the past progressive. Now, let's start from what we learned about the past simple. We said the past simple indicates that an activity or situation began and ended at a particular time in the past. So when I say I walked to school yesterday, John lived in Paris for 10 years, but now he lives in Rome. I bought a new car 3 days ago. All of these actions happened in the past and ended in the past. Now you might want to say, I bought a new car 3 days ago. That's not past. I still have the car. That's true. You have the car now. But the action of buying the car happened 3 days ago. You're not buying the car now. You're not still buying the car, right? So the focus is on actions that happened in the past and finished in the past. And you might have heard before that when you want to use the past simple with the past continuous, you use when, and you say, for example, I was doing something, that's the past continuous, when I did this. That's the past simple. And I'm not saying that's wrong. But the problem is, or not the problem actually, the thing is that we can use when and both parts of the sentence can contain the past simple alone without past continuous. So do not just use the past continuous automatically when you see when. It depends on what you want to say. If you just want to say that two things happened in the past and you just want to show me the sequence of these actions, you want to show me which action happened first, so you can use when and you can use both of them in the past simple. For example, Rita stood under a tree when it began to rain. So here, both of them, stood is the past of stand, began the past of begin. Both of them are past simple. But what does that mean? Why didn't I use Rita was standing under a tree when it began to rain? Well, I can, of course. That is not wrong grammatically, but the meaning is a little bit different. If we have a sentence like this that contains when and has the simple past in both clauses, the action in the when clause happens first. If this is what you want to tell me, if what you want to tell me is, I want to show you which action happened first, so then use this action that happened first with the when clause. So here, if we read again this sentence, Rita stood under a tree when it began to rain. If I ask you what happened first, did it begin to rain first, then Rita stood under the tree? Or did Rita stand under the tree, then it began to rain? Obviously, the thing that happened first is the thing that is in the when part. So when it began to rain, she stood under the tree. It began to rain first, then she stood under the tree. Now let's take a look at another example. When Mrs. Chu heard a strange noise, she got up to investigate. Now, this one obviously is logical because we know that you first need to hear something so that you get up and investigate. So obviously, Mrs. Chu, when Mrs. Chu heard that happened first, she got up to investigate that happened next. Or we can say, when I dropped my cup, the coffee spilled on my lap. And that is also obvious. You dropped the cup first and the coffee spilled on my lap. So you might want to say, well, why do I have to use when here at all? Well, you can say, I dropped my cup, the coffee spilled on my lap. Well, simply, if you want to say it without when, you will use two sentences instead of one. And it's always a better way to use one sentence instead of two, if you can. And here we can, because we can use when to make this possible. Instead of saying, I dropped my cup, period, the coffee spilled on my lap, period. And here, yeah, obviously, everybody will understand that I dropped my cup first and the coffee spilled on my lap later. Yeah, but why don't you make that in one sentence using when? When I dropped my cup, the coffee spilled on my lap. And when you do that, you can use both parts in the past simple, but you will have to make sure that you use the action that happened first in the first part. Now, sometimes this can be very useful because it can tell you which action happened first because it's not always logical. Like in the first example, Rita stood under a tree when it began to rain. There's nothing logical that can tell me which happened first, except for I know that because I can see that when it began to rain. When it began to rain, so that means this happened first. There's no logical explanation for that. But when helped me decide which action happened first, or help me know which action happened first. So, with that being said, I just mentioned this before we start talking about the past continuous, especially the when part, because it is always this problem in the mind of English language learners that they try to seek words that can show them which tense to use. No, it's not like that, guys. The thing is that the English grammar is just a tool for what you want to mean. First comes the meaning, whatever you want to say. That's the first thing that should come to your mind. It doesn't matter if you don't get it right from the first try. You can learn. It's easy to learn grammar. But the thing is, start with what you want to say, start with the meaning in mind, and then seek out the tools to make this meaning clear for English language speakers. So here we're learning tools. Grammar is just learning tools, and your job later is choosing the right tool for the meaning you want to convey. So with that being said, let's move on now to talk about the past progressive. Now, the past progressive is the verb to be in the past, of course, and the verb in ing form. So I was walking, she was standing, he was playing, etc. But here, because we talked about when, this might be one of the most common ways we can use the past continuous with the past simple. So let's start with this first example. I was walking down the street when it began to rain. Now here, if we look at this, I was walking down the street when it began to rain. What was happening first? I was walking down the street, and then it began to rain. And the thing is that I was walking down the street, that was a continuous action. It was not something that happened in a flash. So here, the idea is both action occurred at the same time, but one action began earlier and was in progress when the other action happened or occurred. So I was walking down the street when it began to rain. Now, the two actions happened at the same time, the walking part and beginning to rain part. But here, the thing is that I was walking, that action happened earlier, happened before it started to rain. And when it started to rain, this walking action was in progress. Let's take a look at another example so we can see that more clearly. While I was walking down the street, it began to rain. Rita was standing under a tree when it began to rain. So here, if you remember, we said Rita stood under a tree when it began to rain. Now, that is the opposite. Rita was standing under a tree when it began to rain. So she didn't get wet at all because she was standing there and then it began to rain. The standing part happened first. Or sometimes we don't even need when or while. We can say at 8 o'clock last night, I was studying. Now, in this example, my studying began before 8 o'clock, was in progress at that time, and probably continued. It doesn't matter for how long, but probably it continued. But at this specific time, maybe I'm asking you, I called you yesterday at 8 o'clock, and you didn't pick up. Why? What were you doing? What were you doing? Always the question is in the past continuous. At that specific time, yesterday, what were you doing? Because if I'm calling you now and I'm asking about what you are doing now, I can ask you, what are you doing right now? Let's go out somewhere. But yesterday I called you and you didn't pick up. What were you doing? Well, at 8 o'clock last night, I was studying. So my studying began before 8 o'clock, was in progress at that time, and probably continued. Now, one last point about this. I'll go back to this when and while, and you might think, okay, yes, I can use the past simple in both parts, and I can use the past continuous in one part, and then the past simple in the second part. But can I use the past continuous in both parts? That's a question. Let's see if we can or we can't, and what does that mean? Sometimes the past progressive is used in both parts of a sentence when two actions are in progress simultaneously. For example, while I was studying in one room of our apartment, my roommate was having a party in the other room. So both actions were happening at the same time. Both actions were in progress. So you see, you can use that. And there's nothing like, oh my God, that's a taboo, that we don't use that. We don't do that. There's almost nothing you can do with grammar. It all depends on what you mean. So remember that. And now that we've talked about that, I still have one more point before we finish this episode, and that is to talk about unfulfilled intentions. Now, this is a common use in the past, and we use the past continuous for it. So we say, for example, Jack was going to go to the movies last night, but he changed his mind. So he was going to do something. Well, we use was or were going to, and a verb, of course, to talk about past intentions. Usually these are unfulfilled intentions, which means activities someone intended to do but did not do. Now here, Jack was going to go to the movies last night, but he changed his mind. That means Jack was planning to go to the movies, but he did not go. He had the intention to go to the movies. He wanted to go to the movies, but he did not. For some reason. Doesn't matter, but I'm talking about unfulfilled intentions. And we have other ways of expressing unfulfilled intentions, and that is by using plan, hope, intend, or think about in the past progressive itself. So we can say, for example, I was planning to go, but I didn't. Or I was hoping to go, but I couldn't. Or I was intending to go, but I didn't. Or I was thinking about going, but I didn't. So you see, if you want to talk about unfulfilled intentions, you can use one of these verbs in the past continuous, or you can use was, were, going to, any verb you want. Now, with that being said, that is all I want to talk about concerning the past simple and the past continuous. Of course, there's a lot more, but we will talk about that in other episodes to come. I want to remind you again that you can find practice that you can use to cement the information you learned here in this episode and in other episodes on our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. There's a custom post for every episode we create. You will find there show notes, activities, interactive activities, videos, and interactive videos, and a downloadable PDF practice worksheet that you can download for free. Do and check your answers using the answer key we provide. All of these learning opportunities are possible if you take the link you will find in the description and go to our website. And there's also the link for Patreon. Don't forget to support us on Patreon if you can. And if you can't, share the word. Maybe one of your friends or one of your family can do that for us. And that'll be a big help for us to continue and to create more of the content you love. With that being said, this is your host, Danny. I want to thank you very much for listening to another episode in English Plus Podcast. I will see you next time.